Obese girl locked in cage and displayed. At town fair, mountain man broke cage and claimed her as his $5 for the glutton's shame. The preacher bellowed, and Iron Ridge answered with silence that cut like a knife. Autumn flags snapped above the harvest fair, brass horns blared, and sugared smoke from kettle corn curled through the square, but all color drained to gray at the center, a traveling menagerie cage, iron bars meant for bears, not daughters. Inside, Millicent Millie Ashford crouched in a torn calico dress, arms wrapped around herself, cheeks raw with salt and dust. A placard nailed high proclaimed her a monster, a warning, a spectacle. Children were lifted to see, boys threw pebbles to prove they were men, women pressed gloved hands to mouths and did nothing. Reverend Cornelius Ashford, her father, paced like a ringmaster who'd baptized his cruelty. "Behold the wages of gluttony," he roared, voice bouncing off brick and tin. "She ate our table bare and our patience thinner. God has made of her a sign." Prudence Ashford stood rigid at his elbow, eyes like shuttered windows. "We offered fasting," she said coolly, "and she chose sin." Laughter rippled. A tomato burst against a bar and bled down to Millie's skirt. Millie did not plead. She had learned long ago that begging only fed the wolves. She breathed slow and shallow, counting in her head the stitches she might mend if her hands were free. A seamstress counts because arithmetic is kinder than a crowd. Her shoulders shook anyway when a stone grazed her temple. Somewhere in the noise, a boy asked if shame had a sound. It did. It sounded like his mother saying, "Hush." Then the fair's brass chorus faltered. A different metal voice entered the square, a groan of bolts, and a low, measured tread that made boards remember their nails. The crowd turned as one, the way wheat turns under wind. Dominic Steelheart filled the street the way a storm fills the sky. Tall as a folly of timber, shoulders broad beneath a wolf-black coat, he moved without hurry and without doubt. Blue eyes caught the light like river ice. The beard could not hide the set of a jaw that had broken other men's certainties. He did not ask permission. He did not even glance at the sheriff, who suddenly found a message to read on his boots. "Sir!" Reverend Ashford planted himself between the giant and the cage, voice sprouting borrowed courage. "This is family discipline, godly instruction." Dominic shifted him aside with one palm, gentle as a door, final as a wall. He stepped to the bars and looked in. Millie raised her head. For the first time that day, someone's gaze reached her without hunger or hate. He spoke so quietly that only she and the iron heard him. "You don't belong in a cage." His hands found the bars. Tendons stood like braided cable. Iron sang protest, high, shocked, then surrendering by degrees. A gasp traveled the square. Not a cheer, not yet, but the sharp intake when a lie meets daylight. Bars bent. Space opened. Dominic ducked in, slipped his coat around Millie's shoulders, and lifted her as if weight were a quarrel he'd already settled with the world. Prudence's voice turned brittle. "Kidnapping! Sheriff!" "Testify first," Dominic said, eyes cold, "to your own crimes." He stepped out with Millie in his arms, and the crowd stepped back, because every creature, even a cruel one, recognizes a line it fears to cross. Reverend Ashford sputtered scripture. Dominic answered with motion, toward the horse he had tied, toward the road that climbed into pines, toward a different ending than the one the placard promised. Before the dust swallowed them, he looked once over his shoulder at the fair and said evenly, "She's claimed." By the time Dominic reached the livery at the edge of the square, Ironridge had already begun to rewrite what it had seen. Some said the giant tore iron like cloth. Others claimed the bars had rusted, that it had all been show. Lies are softer to sleep on than guilt. He ignored them. His focus was the woman in his arms, breath quick against his throat, a pulse beating fast at the hollow beneath her ear. He set Millie on a hay bale in the half-shadow of the stable and shrugged out of his coat to cushion her back. "Hurts anywhere you can't name?" he asked, voice low. She swallowed. "Everywhere that's been called a sin." He met her gaze, steady. "Pain isn't a sermon, it's a wound. Wounds can be mended." Up close, he could count the small violences the town had chosen to call virtue. Purple blooms along her upper arms where hands had gripped, a scrape at the temple, a bruise on the shin the size of a palm. But beneath the hurt, he saw what Ironridge had refused to see. A seamstress' sure hands, even when they trembled, a face that tried not to ask for mercy, and a spine that, even caged, had not learned to kneel. The stable boy hovered, eyes wide. Dominic pressed a coin into his palm. Hot water, clean cloths, quiet. The boy ran. Millie watched Dominic wrap a strip of linen around her temple with the care of a man binding the haft of a favorite tool. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know cages," he said, "and the kind of men who build them." Her mouth tilted, almost a smile, almost a flinch. "Reverend Ashford builds them with Scripture." "Then he's confused his book with his chains." Hoofbeats clattered in the street. Prudence's voice, sharp as sleet, cut through the noise. The sheriff mumbled about keeping order. The preacher thundered about theft and hellfire. Dominic neither hurried nor hid. He finished the bandage, helped Millie into his coat again, and lifted her to the saddle of the rangy bay tied near the door. "Can you sit a horse?" he asked. "I can try." "You won't have to try alone." He swung up behind her, an arm braced around her without possessiveness, only promise. When the sheriff finally found his courage enough to step into the lane, Dominic reined the bay just long enough to speak over the horse's breath. "You saw the cage," he said. "If law still means anything here, write your report accordingly." The sheriff, who had seen the cage and his reflection in every bar, dropped his eyes. "Best you ride." Dominic did. The town fell behind in a rush of boards and brick and voices, learning how to doubt themselves. Wind lifted Millie's hair. She clutched the horn, dizzy, then steadied as his palm splayed lightly across her ribs, pressure enough to anchor, gentle enough not to claim. When Ironridge dwindled to a smear of smoke, he slowed to an easy jog along the creek road and finally to a walk beneath the yellowing aspens. They rode like that for a mile before words found her. "He'll call it kidnapping." "He can call it sunrise if it soothes him," Dominic said. "Truth will not change its color." "He is my father," she said, the syllables dull with old bruises. "That makes his words heavy. It does not make them true." They came to a fallen log at the creek bend. He dismounted, lifted her down without asking if she could manage, because he had already decided she would not be asked to prove herself to him. He gave her water. She drank as if remembering how. "My mother stood beside him," Millie said, eyes on the current. "When I was small, she stitched samplers that said charity begins at home. She put them on the parlor wall and never read them again." "What did you stitch?" he asked. "Gussets, hems, shirt cuffs for men who would not meet my eyes when they came to pay, then told their wives I'd overcharged." She looked at her hands. Thread listens if you treat it gentle. It tells you when to loosen your pull. I learned that at 12. I have not yet learned it for myself." He considered that, then nodded once. "You will?" The boy from the livery had followed at a distance, curiosity hand in hand with fear. When he reached them, he thrust a small bundle into Milly's arms, clean cloths, 2 biscuits wrapped in paper, then fled, as if kindness were contraband. Milly stared at the bundle, throat tight. "Thank you," she said to the path where the boy had been. The words trembled, but stood upright. Dominic set about arranging the saddle with a blanket folded double, so the tree would not press her ribs. The movement told a story of its own, of years in the high country where a mistake could cost flesh and winter had no mercy for the proud. His hands were nicked and scarred, the catalogue of a life lived against stone and weather. "What is your name?" she asked suddenly, startled to realize she did not know it. "Dominic Steelheart." She almost laughed. "They named you while you were breaking something." "They named me when I refused to be broken," he said mildly. "And you, Milly Ashford, what did they name you for?" "Millicent, the lady they hoped I'd become," she said. "Milly, the burden I was." He tipped his head, studying her as if measuring a plank. "I see neither burden nor lady. I see a woman who endured 3 days in a cage and kept her eyes clear. That seems name enough." They rode again as the sun turned the creek to hammered brass. He told her little about himself, only that he trapped and hunted through the high meadows, that he shod his own horses and mended his own boots, that once a month he rode to the trading post with pelts and ironwork, and returned with flour, salt, and very few words. The rest she saw without being told. The way he watched the tree line without appearing to, the habit of choosing the higher bank where the ground would drain if a storm came, the patience of a man who has learned to speak only when the thing he says matters. "Why did you come to town today?" she asked after a while. "Horses needed liniment," he said. "I needed coffee, and Iron Ridge needed to be reminded that a heart is not a spectacle." She turned that over, felt it settle inside her like a stone that held heat. "And if my father follows? Then we'll decide together what comes next." The word together startled her more than the iron had. It made a space inside her she had not known to miss, a small room with a chair and a window and a door that was not locked. Dusk found them on a rise where the whole valley lay open. Far away, the fair's music thinned to a tired ribbon of sound. Here, crickets worked, water talked, and the first chill of evening crept down the slope. Dominic drew the bay to a halt and looked toward the north, where the land lifted into darker shoulders. "My cabin's 15 miles through the pass," he said. "You'll rest tonight at a lined shack I keep near the foothills. Tomorrow we climb." She nodded, fear and relief braided tight. "If I slow you?" "You won't," he said, and there was no room in the word for argument. He swung down, offered his hand, and when she took it, she felt an odd thing, her own weight returning to her on better terms, not erased, not mocked, simply recognized and accounted for as a pack is balanced before a long road. Behind them, the town's bells began to toll the evening hour. Ahead, a coyote called and was answered. Dominic lifted her back to the saddle and mounted behind. The bay started forward, steady as a promise. "Whatever they named you," he said, guiding the horse into the gathering blue, "you're not theirs any more." Milly looked once over her shoulder at the place where the cage had been, and then forward into the pines. The road did not ask her to be small to travel it. "Then let's ride," she said. By midnight, the fair was only a whisper behind them, a flicker of distant lanterns, and the faint echo of a hymn warped by wind. The mountains ahead swallowed every trace of it. The road narrowed, then turned to dirt, then to nothing but the memory of wagon ruts fading into pine needles. Millie rode pressed against Dominic's chest, wrapped in his coat that smelled of smoke and juniper. Each sway of the horse rocked her toward sleep, but pain kept her half awake. The ache in her ribs, the rawness, where the ropes had rubbed her wrists, the heaviness of being carried so far beyond what she'd ever known. Dominic rode with a stillness that seemed carved from the same stone as the peaks. Every now and then he murmured to the horse or adjusted her weight slightly so she could breathe easier. When the wind cut sharp across the pass, he shifted the coat tighter around her shoulders. "Does it hurt much?" he asked. She hesitated. "Only when I remember why." "Then let the mountain help you forget." The air grew thinner, cleaner. The smell of frost and pine replaced the stink of fairground smoke. Moonlight caught the snowcaps ahead, turning them silver. Millie had never seen land like this, land that didn't ask permission to exist. It made her small, but not in the way her father's pulpit had. Here, smallness felt like belonging to something vast, not being crushed by it. When they reached a creek that cut across the trail, Dominic dismounted. "We'll rest here." He helped her down, steadying her when her knees threatened to give. She clutched his sleeve until her balance returned. "You should drink," he said, kneeling by the water. He filled a tin cup and offered it to her. The reflection of the moon trembled in it. Millie drank, shivering at the cold. "How do you live out here? No one to talk to, no church, no—" "Plenty to talk to," he said. "The fire answers if you listen. So does the wind." She studied him in the pale light. "You don't sound like a man who hates company." "I don't. I just learned not to mistake noise for company." The fire he built was small, but sure. He moved with the calm of someone who trusted his own hands. Millie watched him slice strips of dried venison, watched the sparks climb and vanish. When he handed her food, she hesitated, embarrassed. "I can't pay you back," she said. "I didn't charge." "Still, you've done more for me than my own kin ever did." Dominic poked at the fire with a stick. "Maybe that's why you shouldn't call them kin anymore." His voice held no pity, just truth, flat and solid as the ground they sat on. Millie wanted to argue but couldn't. The flames painted his face in copper and shadow. For a long time, neither spoke. The night pressed close, filled with the ticking of cooling rocks and the whisper of water. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft. "Why did you come back for me? You could have just walked away." "I didn't come back," he said. "I happened to be there when someone needed to stop being alone." She turned that over in her head, then smiled faintly. "That's a kind way of putting it." "Kindness doesn't cost much," he said, "but most men spend it like it does." After they ate, Dominic spread a blanket for her near the fire. "You'll sleep there. The heat'll hold till morning." "And you?" He nodded toward the horse. "I'll keep watch. Wolves travel these ridges." "Then wake me if they come," she said, surprising herself with how steady it sounded. He studied her face for a moment. "You've got more steel in you than they ever taught you to use." Millie lay down under the coat. The firelight flickered across the inside of her eyelids. She could still hear the fair, the crowd's laughter, but it was fading, replaced by the steady rhythm of the creek and Dominic's low voice humming something that might have been a hymn or just the mountain's tune through a man's throat. She slept. At dawn, frost crusted the edges of her blanket. The fire had burned down to embers, but Dominic was already awake, loading the saddle. He looked larger in daylight, less myth and more man. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt, and his breath smoked in the cold air. He noticed her watching. "We've got miles before the sun sets. Can you ride?" "I can." "Good. We'll make the foothills by noon." As they rode, the land opened wider, pine giving way to meadow, meadow rising again into cliffs that glowed gold in morning light. Milly's body ached, but her spirit felt lighter. She found herself speaking without planning to. "When I was little, I used to sew doll dresses out of scraps. I thought if I made something beautiful, maybe Mama would see me instead of hate me." Dominic glanced at her. "And did she?" "No, but the dolls looked lovely anyway." He smiled. "Barely there, but real." "Then you learned something useful. Beauty's still beauty, even if fools don't recognize it." They rode in silence after that, a silence that felt less like distance and more like understanding. By late afternoon, clouds gathered over the peaks. The wind smelled of snow. Dominic found a stand of spruce and led the horse beneath it. He built another fire, larger this time, and handed Milly a tin cup of coffee so strong it bit her tongue. "Stay close to the flames," he said. She nodded. "You really think my father will come?" "He'll try. Some men can't live unless they're proving they're righteous." "And if he finds us?" Dominic looked into the fire. "Then I'll remind him what judgment feels like when it's fair." The way he said it, quiet, certain, should have scared her. Instead, it felt like warmth spreading beneath her ribs. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. He laid another log on the fire. "We'll move at first light. The cabin's just a day away." Milly sipped her coffee, watching flakes melt against her sleeve. "A whole day still?" He nodded. "Don't worry. The mountain knows its own." She looked up at him, the man who had broken her cage, who now broke the silence of her loneliness, and thought that maybe, for the first time, she was beginning to belong to herself. By the time the snowstorm broke, the world around them had turned to glass and silver. The trail that wound up the ridge was half buried, and their breath came out in pale clouds that hung in the still air before vanishing. Milly's legs trembled when Dominic finally pointed ahead. "There," he said. The cabin sat cradled between two pines, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. It wasn't grand, just a long, low house built from dark logs, shutters pulled tight against the cold, but to Milly it looked like salvation itself. He lifted her down from the horse and steadied her as her boots sank into the snow. "Easy now. Inside's warm." The first thing she noticed when he opened the door was the smell: cedar, wood smoke, and something faintly sweet, like pine sap. The second was the quiet. Not the oppressive quiet of the cage or the church pew, but the kind that feels like safety. A large hearth took up most of one wall. Firelight spilled across a rough-hewn table, a shelf lined with jars, and a bearskin rug stretched before the flames. There was a single broad bed pushed into the corner, a rocking chair near the window, and the hum of the storm muffled by thick walls. Dominic moved through the space with practiced ease, hanging up his coat, stoking the fire, setting water to boil. Millie stood near the threshold, uncertain where to place herself. "You can sit," he said, noticing her hesitation. "The chair by the hearth's the warmest." She obeyed, her body sighing with relief as heat seeped into her bones. For a while the only sounds were the crackle of wood and the pop of sap. When he handed her a mug of broth, she hesitated. "You keep saying nothing costs anything out here, yet you do all this for me." Dominic shrugged. "A fire burns the same, whether it warms one or two." His voice was gentle, but his eyes, clear and blue as a high lake, were serious. He wasn't making light of what he'd done. To him, this was just the right order of things. Millie sipped, the warmth flooding through her chest. "It's the first thing I've eaten that didn't taste like punishment," she murmured. He didn't answer, but something in his face softened. That first night, Dominic gave her the bed and took the floor by the fire. "Don't argue," he said when she tried to protest. "I've slept colder and harder." She turned toward the wall, but didn't sleep right away. She could hear him moving now and then, adjusting logs, checking the latch on the door. Once she opened her eyes and saw his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the fire. For the first time in years, she drifted off without fear. Days passed into a rhythm so natural that it felt almost like memory. Dominic chopped wood, hunted rabbits, and checked his traps in the hills. Millie swept the floor, mended his shirts, and learned the small language of the cabin, where he kept the matches, how he measured the coffee, which logs burned slowest through the night. In the mornings, he'd open the shutters and let in the thin winter sun. The mountains outside gleamed white and endless, their silence alive with unseen movement. Fox tracks, the call of a hawk. Once she asked, "Don't you ever get lonely?" He gave a half smile. "Sometimes, but loneliness is lighter than disappointment." She understood that better than she wished she did. When he caught her struggling to lift a bucket from the well, he didn't take it from her. Instead, he showed her how to balance her stance, how to use her weight as leverage. "You don't fight the work," he said. "You make it work for you." That advice, she realized, wasn't only about buckets. In the evenings, they ate together at the table, stew, cornbread, sometimes fish if he'd been lucky with the traps. She sewed while he read or carved small pieces of wood into animals. He gave her one, a small bear, clumsy but full of heart. "For your shelf," he said. Millie ran her thumb over the rough carving. "You make the bear look gentle." "Even bears have someone they protect," he said quietly. When the first thaw came, she began to hum as she worked. Dominic would pause sometimes, axe in mid-air, just to listen. One afternoon, while she beat dust from a quilt outside, she caught him watching her through the open door. Embarrassed, she blushed. "What?" He leaned against the frame, wiping his hands. "You're smiling. Haven't seen that often." She looked down at the quilt, flustered. "I didn't mean to." "Don't stop." It was such a simple thing, but it made her throat tighten. "You're kind, Dominic. Too kind." He shook his head. "Kindness isn't a favor. It's a way of staying human." That night, as snow began to fall again, she told him about her life before. The sermons, the punishments, the endless attempts to shrink herself to fit her parents' vision of virtue. She spoke quietly, haltingly, like someone testing if words could still hold truth. When she finished, Dominic said, "They wanted obedience. You gave them survival. That's more than obedience ever bought anyone." She met his eyes across the firelight. "You talk like a preacher." "Was once," he said after a pause. "For a little while." She blinked. "Truly?" He nodded. "Before I learned that some pulpits echo louder than the heavens, I left before I forgot why words were made." "What made you remember?" He looked at her, and the corners of his mouth softened. "Maybe you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, dense, alive. She turned toward the fire, hiding a trembling smile. As spring finally loosened the snow, Millie began to venture farther outside. She helped plant vegetables in the thawing soil, learned to catch fish from the creek, and even dared to climb the ridge behind the cabin to look at the world from above. The mountains stretched forever, blue and white and green. She stood there, wind tugging her hair, and for the first time she didn't feel like a burden. She felt vast. That evening she brought wildflowers inside, placing them in a tin cup on the table. Dominic looked at them and said softly, "House hasn't smelled like spring in a long time." Millie smiled. Maybe it just needed another pair of hands. He stepped closer, hesitating for a heartbeat before brushing a stray petal from her hair. His touch was careful, reverent. "And another heart," he added quietly. For a moment they stood in the glow of the hearth, the silence between them heavy with something unspoken. Millie felt her pulse flutter like a trapped bird, but not from fear. "Dominic," she said softly, almost a whisper. "Yes?" "Thank you for giving me a place where I don't have to be less." He looked at her for a long time. "You were never less, Millie. The world just tried to make you believe it." The fire popped, sending a small spark toward the hearthstone. Millie's eyes reflected the flame, steady and bright. For the first time since the cage, she realized she wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. By early summer, the mountains had turned soft again. Snowmelt carved thin silver threads through the grass, and the sound of running water was constant, like the earth remembering how to breathe. Millie and Dominic's days slipped into an easy rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons mending fences, evenings by the fire. But peace, as Dominic knew too well, is not something the world lets a man keep for long. It began with a letter. He found it nailed to the fence post one morning, the paper flapping like a torn flag in the wind. The handwriting was sharp and righteous. To the man calling himself Dominic Steelheart, "You are harboring a woman stolen from her rightful guardians. Return Millicent Ashford to Iron Ridge by the next full moon, or face the Lord's justice." There was no signature, only a wax seal pressed with a cross. Millie was kneeling in the garden when he came back. She looked up at his face and went still. "It's him, isn't it?" Dominic didn't answer. He handed her the note instead. Her hands trembled as she read it. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He'll never stop. He thinks I'm still his property." Dominic took the paper from her, tore it in half, and fed it to the fire in the stove. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges until the words turned to ash. "He can't claim what he gave away," he said, "and you don't belong to him." "But the law isn't written by men like him," Dominic interrupted. "It's enforced by them. That's the difference." She stared at the ashes until they were gone. Then, quietly, "He'll come here, won't he?" Dominic nodded. "Yes, and when he does, I'll be ready." That evening, Millie couldn't eat. She kept glancing toward the window as if expecting to see her father's shadow standing in the trees. Dominic noticed, of course. "He's just a man," he said softly, "not a god. He bleeds like one, too." Millie shook her head. "He's not just my father, Dominic. He's a preacher. Men follow him. They think everything he says comes from heaven." Dominic's eyes darkened. "Then heaven's got poor taste in messengers." She almost laughed, but it came out as a sob. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her chair. His hands found hers, rough palms against trembling fingers. "You're safe here," he said. "No one gets through those woods unless I let them." Millie squeezed his hand, searching his face. "You can't fight the whole world for me." He smiled faintly. "I don't plan to. Just the part that comes knocking." Days passed. The forest grew uneasy. Tracks appeared near the stream. Boots, not hooves. Dominic began setting snares, not for animals, but for men. At night, he sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the tree line. Millie hated the tension that crept into the house. It felt like a second winter pressing down. She tried to keep herself busy, baking, mending, cleaning, but every sound from outside made her flinch. One afternoon, while Dominic was checking traps, she found herself wandering toward the small locked chest he kept beneath the stairs. He'd never forbidden her to touch it, but something about the way he avoided it had always felt sacred. She hesitated only a moment before lifting the lid. Inside was a folded black coat, worn but carefully kept. A small silver cross rested on top, alongside a Bible and a photograph. Dominic in uniform beside a woman with dark hair and a smile that reached her eyes. Rosemary. Beneath the photo lay a stack of letters, all unopened. The first was addressed to Reverend Dominic Steele. Millie froze. Reverend. When Dominic returned at dusk, he found her sitting at the table, the letters spread out like confessions between them. "You were a preacher," she said quietly. He closed the door behind him. "I was." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I stopped being one the day I buried my wife and son." He sat opposite her, the firelight cutting deep lines into his face. "I believed I could speak for God once. I thought faith could mend everything. But when they died, I realized faith doesn't stop the cold from coming through the door. It doesn't hold your hand when the blood won't stop. It doesn't listen back." Millie swallowed hard. "And now? Now I believe in smaller things. Fire, bread, keeping someone safe." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You still preach, Dominic. You just do it with kindness instead of words." He looked up then, and for the first time she saw shame in his eyes. Shame not for what he'd done, but for what he still feared losing. The next morning, the forest finally answered her father's call. Dogs barked somewhere down the valley. The echo of men shouting rose through the trees. Dominic stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. "They're close," he said. "Half a day at most." Millie stood in the doorway, pale but steady. "What will you do?" "Meet them before they reach us." He turned back to her. "You'll stay inside, bolt the door, and don't open it for anyone but me." "No." Her voice surprised them both. "I won't hide. Not again." "Millie," she stepped forward, "I spent 27 years behind bars that didn't even need iron. I'm not living behind another door." He stared at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Then you stay behind me. No closer, no farther. She almost smiled. Deal. Before leaving, he took the old silver cross from the chest and slipped it into his pocket. Not for faith, he said, for memory. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened. Thunder rolled in from the peaks like distant drums. The scent of rain filled the air. They reached the edge of the meadow just as the first figures appeared, men with rifles, and at their center Reverend Cornelius Ashford in his long black coat, his voice rising above the wind. "Return my daughter, you heathen! The Lord's justice will strike you down." Millie's pulse hammered, but Dominic didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, not to aim, but to speak. "Your daughter is free," he said, "and the only thing striking anyone down tonight will be the storm." Cornelius sneered. "You think you can fight righteousness?" Dominic's voice stayed calm. "I don't fight righteousness, just cruelty wearing its mask." The men hesitated, confused by the mountain of a man who didn't sound like a savage at all. But Cornelius shouted again, and the spell broke. The first shot cracked through the rain. Dominic pushed Millie down behind a fallen log. "Stay low," he said. "I'm not leaving you." He glanced at her, a fierce smile cutting through the chaos. "I wasn't asking you to." Lightning flashed, thunder shook the ground, and the mountain itself seemed to take sides. The storm broke open all at once, lightning slashing across the sky, rain pouring so hard it stung the skin. The smell of wet earth and gunpowder mingled as the first volley cracked through the clearing. Dominic moved like he'd been born inside battle. Every motion was deliberate, no wasted breath, no panic. He fired once, reloaded, shifted position, fired again. Each shot sent a man sprawling into the mud. Millie pressed herself low behind the fallen log, heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. But when one of the attackers tried to flank them, she didn't scream. She grabbed the rifle Dominic had given her days before, just in case, and aimed with trembling hands. The man crashed through the brush, raising his weapon. Millie's shot cracked louder than thunder. He dropped instantly, rifle flying from his hands. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she barely felt it. Dominic turned, eyes wide. For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other through the rain. He gave a sharp nod, pride, not surprise, then turned back to the fight. Reverend Cornelius shouted over the storm, his voice full of venom. "You think God will bless this? A whore and a heretic? You're damned already." Dominic stood to his full height, rain streaming down his face. "If hell means she's free, then I'll see you there." He surged forward, reloading as he ran. A flash of lightning lit the field, the preacher's men scattering, some dropping their weapons, others firing blindly. Dominic closed the distance in seconds. Cornelius raised his pistol and fired. The bullet grazed Dominic's shoulder, tearing cloth and skin, but the mountain man didn't slow. He slammed into the preacher, sending them both to the ground. The pistol flew into the mud. They struggled, rolling through water and dirt. The preacher's face twisted with rage. "You bewitched her. She was mine to discipline." Dominic grabbed the man by the collar, hauling him up so their faces were inches apart. "She was never yours," he growled. "You only owned her fear." Cornelius spat blood into his face. "She's tainted, like her mother." The words hit something deep in Millie, sharper than any bullet. She rose, mud clinging to her dress, and stepped forward through the rain. Her voice shook, but carried clear. "No, Father, Mama wasn't tainted. She was broken by your cruelty, just like you tried to break me. But I'm not afraid any more." Cornelius turned toward her, eyes wild. "You ungrateful wretch." He never finished. Dominic's fist drove into his jaw, dropping him into the mud. The preacher lay there, gasping, blood mixing with rain. Dominic looked down at him, chest heaving. "You call this justice?" Cornelius snarled, "God will judge me." Dominic shook his head. "Then he can start tonight." He turned away, grabbed Millie's hand, and led her toward the tree line. "It's over," he said quietly. But as they neared the horses, a gunshot cracked. The preacher, half conscious, had dragged his pistol from the mud. The bullet hit Dominic in the side. "Dominic!" Millie screamed, catching him as he stumbled. He grimaced, pressing a hand to the wound. "It's fine," he said through clenched teeth. "It missed anything that matters." Her eyes filled with tears. "You matter?" She spun, fury blazing through her grief. She picked up Dominic's rifle and leveled it at her father. He stared up at her, mud-streaked, eyes full of twisted righteousness. "Go on, then," he rasped. "Finish your rebellion." Millie's finger trembled on the trigger, but then she lowered the gun. "No," she said, "you don't deserve to decide who I become." She turned her back on him, supporting Dominic with one arm as the rain began to ease. The thunder rolled farther away, like the mountain exhaling after holding its breath. By the time the sun rose, the preacher's men had fled, leaving their master in the mud. The forest was silent again except for birds and the distant rush of the creek. Dominic leaned heavily against her, pale but smiling faintly. "Told you," he murmured. "Storm's over." Millie wiped the rain from his face with shaking hands. "We're going home," she said. He nodded. Home. They walked back through the pines, two silhouettes against the pale morning, one carrying the weight of a wound, the other carrying the weight of freedom. And for the first time, they both felt the same thing. Peace. The climb back to the cabin was slow. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of thunder and smoke. Dominic leaned against Millie, his arm heavy over her shoulders, his steps uneven but steady. Every few paces she whispered, "Almost there," more for herself than for him. When they reached the porch, the mountains seemed to hold their breath. Millie pushed the door open and guided him inside. The familiar scent of cedar and smoke wrapped around them like an embrace. She eased him onto the bed, lit the fire with shaking hands, and fetched clean water. Dominic gritted his teeth as she cleaned the wound, but didn't complain. "You're shaking," he said softly. "So are you." He managed a faint smile. "Guess that makes us even." When the bleeding slowed, she stitched the gash with hands that had once only known a needle for fine silk and lace. Now she sewed flesh with the same care. Every pull of thread was a prayer not to heaven, but to the mountain that had spared them. When it was done, he caught her wrist. "You saved me." She shook her head. "You saved me first." He pulled her close, their foreheads touching. "Then maybe we just keep doing that, over and over." Outside, the clouds began to part. Shafts of sunlight slipped through the pines, painting gold on the snowmelt. The birds started to sing again, tentative at first, then fuller, louder, as if the mountain itself was rejoicing. Days later, Dominic was strong enough to stand. Millie helped him outside, where the air was sweet and sharp. They sat on the steps, watching the last of the ice drift down the creek. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked quietly. Dominic shook his head. "Men like him don't chase what they can't control. He'll find another sermon to hide behind." Millie was silent for a while. Then she said, "I don't hate him any more, Not really. I just pity him. He built a cage for the world, and he's the one who never got out." Dominic looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the trembling woman from the fairground, but a flame, steady, alive, unafraid. "You did," he said. "You got out." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "No," she murmured, "we did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver cross he'd taken from the chest. The rain had washed the tarnish away. He set it gently on her palm. "Keep it," he said, "not for faith, for memory." She closed her fingers around it, eyes glistening. "Then we'll make new ones, ones that don't hurt to hold." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Dominic slipped his arm around her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The world below Iron Ridge went on, but high in the mountains the cage was gone, the bars rusted into soil, and two souls who'd been told they were unworthy sat side by side, free, scarred, and utterly alive. Every time a story like Millie and Dominic's reaches someone's heart, it reminds us that love doesn't bloom in perfection. It survives in broken places, in the quiet after storms, in the hands that choose to mend instead of wound. If you've ever felt trapped by others' judgment, remember, cages can be broken, and freedom often looks like kindness, shared between two bruised souls. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you still believe that compassion can heal what cruelty destroys, stay with us. The next story, Waiting Beyond These Mountains, was written for you.